We're joined today by State Representative Josh Siegel. You're sponsoring a bill to address political violence against elected officials. Was there any particular incident that prompted you to offer this bill?
Yeah, I mean, really, it was inspired by and instigated by the recent assassination of the Minnesota state representative and her husband, and the attempted assassination of the Minnesota state senator and his spouse, as well as the arson of the governor's mansion, and just in general, really, I think the alarming rise that we've seen in political violence and its unfortunate normalization. I think there's a numbness that's starting to materialize, in a sense that it's becoming all too common. But in particular, I think it was really the fact that there were so many January 6th offenders, particularly those who committed violent acts against law enforcement officials, who were pardoned. And that is a worrying degree of normalization of political violence. There's no accountability for folks who engaged in one of the most heinous acts in American history.
Why do you think there's an increase in the frequency of violent acts against elected officials?
I think it's the rise in dangerous rhetoric. I think if you listen to the way that a lot of national political figures, and in particular, folks within the MAGA movement, talk about opposite members of the opposing party, and talk about, Democrats as enemies of the people, or as partisans, as a threat to the country, in a way that encourages folks to use extrajudicial means, and encourages folks to take matters into their own hands. I worry about the way that we are talking about our fellow Americans, our fellow Pennsylvanians. At the end of the day, we can have ideological differences, we can have policy differences, but we are still Americans, we're still Pennsylvanians, and at the end of the day, we all, I like to believe, love our country and our Commonwealth. And I worry about the way that we talk about each other, and the way that we talk about political officials as enemies and dangers and threats, in a way where people believe violence is the only means of rectifying the situation, and they no longer have faith in elections or electoral outcomes as a way to resolve our differences.
Do you think that political violence is a partisan problem, or do violent incidents fall on both sides of the political spectrum?
I will say, I mean, it's wrong when either side does it, and there have certainly been individuals who have committed acts of political violence who have been on the other side of the political spectrum. The shooting of Steve Scalise at the congressional baseball game was committed by someone who was very far left and extraordinarily progressive. So no party has a monopoly on violence or ideological violence. I want to be abundantly clear. It's wrong no matter who does it. This should not be a partisan issue or partisan talking point. This should really be about both parties recognizing the danger that this poses to our political system, our democracy, really the stability of our society as a whole. I will say I am more alarmed by, I think, what is a preponderance or a higher propensity I'm alarmed by the higher propensity of rhetoric coming from the far right. I think it is a lot more toxic and dangerous, and a lot more alarmist. It is certainly vitriolic in a way where, you look at folks like Stephen Miller, who are on social media saying that, Democrats are the party of illegal aliens, and, and the way they talk about elected officials as if we're un-American, and that we don't hold the best values of the country, or we don't have the best interests of the country at heart. So I want to be clear. Both sides have certainly had individuals who have cited their ideology or have come from that specific wing of the party, who have committed acts of violence. All of it should be called out, condemned, and cast into the dustbin of history. But I will say that I do think the far right is far more responsible for the alarming rise in political rhetoric.
When you see incidents such as the assassination of Minnesota Speaker Melissa Hortman and her husband, does that impact you or your colleagues personally?
Absolutely. I mean, look, the nature of our job is that we are public servants, and therefore we are accountable and accessible to the public. And so much of what we do requires us to be present and in the public eye. I mean, a great joy that I get from my job is the ability to be in my community and engage with my constituents. I love going to street festivals and backpack giveaways for back to school events. And it's tough now to go to things like that with the thought in the back of your mind that someone might view that event as an opportunity to get to you and to potentially harm you or your loved one. That shooting and assassination of Melissa Hortman occurred during the week of the No Kings protests, which was something I was interested in attending because it was a wonderful opportunity to meet folks in my community who have the same concerns I do about the direction of the country. And I chose not to go that weekend because I didn't want to expose myself or be a target, or by extension, anyone else becomes a target because I'm there. And that is why this is so dangerous, because democracy does require elected officials who are present and accessible and immersed in their community. And that becomes harder when you have fear of physical harm, when you're not sure if that event you go to could put yourself or your spouse or your loved ones in danger. It raises all kinds of prospects too about good people serving in office. We want to encourage folks who look like their community and represent their community, and who have genuine working class backgrounds and have different perspectives to get involved. And instances like this make it all the more likely that good people just choose to forego participation because they have that fear of harm.
Does state government provide adequate resources to ensure the safety for you and your colleagues?
I think that our caucus has done a fantastic job in terms of responding to our concerns, in terms of securitizing our offices, making sure that we do security audits and risk assessments of our district offices to make sure that ourselves and our staff are safe. I will say that there's been a lot of attention and a lot of concern given to our mental health, our physical well-being, our concerns. Shortly after that tragic weekend, we met obviously as a caucus and we talked about our concerns and things that we can do to protect our offices, panic buttons, working with our local police department to make sure that, they're aware if there are any potential individuals that are, of concern. So I think, the tragedy is that there is no foolproof or there's no such thing as 100% security at the end of the day. I think, we can do everything we can. There's you do 1,000 things right and take every precaution and protocol possible. But that's the tragedy of this, is that somebody who wants to do harm and do evil ultimately at some point could find a way. And so I think we've done a great job in terms of making sure we've taken every reasonable precaution we can. But at the same point, it's that balance, because we can't seal ourselves off from the public. We can't isolate ourselves from our constituents. We can't back away from the public aspect of our job. Because not only do I think that allows folks who threaten political violence to win, I think it in and of itself is a surrendering of a critical part of democracy. And so I think there's a limit. I mean, we can't have what are we going to have a full-time security detail for every state representative and every state senator? I mean, at a certain point, one has to ask themselves, like, where does it end? And you can't build a security state around your elected officials.
What would your legislation specifically do?
It would basically expand the maximum penalty for a terrorism charge to life in prison without the possibility of parole. So essentially, death by incarceration. And my belief is this isn't so much about deterrence. Obviously, punishing someone after a crime happens isn't stopping the crime. It's about sending a strong signal as a society. It goes back to the issue of pardoning those violent January 6th offenders who were part of an insurrection, who assaulted hundreds of Capitol Police officers that led to 5 of their deaths, 1 through injuries, 4 through suicide. When those individuals were pardoned and released, it sent a terrible message, I think, to individuals who want to do harm to our democracy and our elected officials, that if your party is in power and you have someone who is callous and cruel and does not care about the damage that you've done and in fact wants to encourage it, they have the power of the pardon. And if folks don't believe that they are going to be properly punished for taking that terrible, destructive, and deadly, act or decision, they're gonna continue to commit those instances. And so, my legislation is about sending a clear moral signal as a society that we have no tolerance for that. And if you do believe that the only way you can resolve your disagreement with a politician is to try to harm them or kill them, you should spend the absolute rest of your life behind bars. There should be no second chances, no forgiveness, because that crime is so severe that it strikes at the very, I think, heart of our political system.
Is there a standard penalty currently for acts of political violence?
There is no standard penalty. Obviously, if the individual who firebombed the governor's mansion was charged with a number of things, terrorism was one of them. Obviously, prosecutors have the ability to layer on a multitude of charges that can ultimately result in, ultimately a life in prison. But the idea is let's have one charge that has true finality. I'm an opponent of the death penalty. I don't believe that we should have the death penalty. I believe it's too great a risk for the country or a state to take that moral hazard that they could inadvertently execute an innocent individual. But I do believe that death by incarceration is a sufficiently strong punishment. And I think this allows a prosecutor to just simply say, you had the goal and intention to kill an elected official, you plotted it, you planned it, it was premeditated. And as a result of that, we are very simply going to say you deserve to die behind bars for that act. You deserve to never, feel the sun on your face again or walk free outside of, a state prison.
Can you talk a little bit about the specific definition within your bill? How do you determine the difference between an acceptable form of political disagreement versus where it leans into the realm of being violent?
Well, I mean, I think there's a difference between posting a disagreement, being angry. I think it's quite clear where that demarcation lies, and it's when you obviously start to instigate violence, insinuate, or say that we need to do something in a way that implies it's quite clear that you want individuals to to harm this person or threaten their physical safety. But obviously, this is really for folks who are actively taking up arms or using violent means to try to affect political outcomes or political discourse. And I think we can clearly sort of tell what that is as a society. If you are masquerading as a law enforcement officer so that you can approach a state representative or state senator's door to kill them, as happened in Minnesota, or you are stockpiling inflammatory devices so you can bomb the governor's mansion, or you are storing up rounds of ammunition and building a manifesto and planning to attack a bunch of elected officials, it's very clear what your intentions are. And I think that is where we want to give prosecutors the maximum possible power, not just for the sake of punishing that individual, but sending a message to society as a whole that there are some crimes that are not only so egregious and some crimes that are so damaging, but there are certain crimes that also just undermine and damage who we are as a people and as a society. And in a democracy, we resolve our differences at the ballot box, and we don't do it with bombs and bullets and knives.
Does similar legislation exist in other states?
It's my knowledge, no. I mean, some states have stronger penalties. I sort of wanted, in my opinion, was make Pennsylvania sort of the gold standard. I think we are obviously the birthplace of democracy. And as the Keystone State, I thought it was important that we take one of the strongest stances against protecting democracy from acts of physical violence and individuals who want to undermine democracy by harming elected officials, by threatening themselves, or threatening elected officials or their staff.
July 15th editorial in the Times Observer regarding your proposal asks, quote, why the life of an elected official is worth more than the life of anyone else in Pennsylvania, end quote. How do you respond to that?
It's not the individual themselves. I like to say there were people who served in my seat before me. There will be people who serve in my seat after me. It is not about my life. It is not about the individual life of any one elected official. In the grand scheme of things, I have the humility to recognize that I am one part of a bigger picture. And ultimately, I am not, there's no ego in this, right? I love what I do. I believe in public service. It is the offices that we hold. It is what our jobs represent. It is the institution that we serve in that matters. And it is not that my life is any more important than anyone else's. I don't believe that. I think we are all equally valuable and equally important. And anyone who wants to do harm to anyone in society should face stiff and severe penalties. I'm a proud supporter of our district attorneys and our local law enforcement. They should have the means they can to hold individuals who want to do innocent folks harm accountable. But at the end of the day, the institutions that we serve in and we represent, the state legislature, whether or the governor's office or Congress, those institutions are bigger than us. They are ultimately what we pledge allegiance to, what we all ultimately support when we go cast a vote. That is why this bill is so important. It is not to say that my life is more important or that, if something should happen to me, I deserve justice first. That's not at all what it is about. It is about saying that the offices we serve in and the institution that we represent must endure, must stand strong, and must persist beyond these efforts by individuals to tear it down or undermine it. And so in that sense, we have to hold those acts of political violence particularly accountable and make sure that those are tamped out. Because if we don't have a democracy and we don't have a society as a whole, everyone suffers. We can't exist in a political system where individuals believe that they can just execute or kill an elected official because they don't like the election outcome, or they don't like a policy position that person holds, or they believe that because somebody's progressive or perhaps more conservative that they are a threat to society. We have to defeat that ideology and that way of thinking. And so that's ultimately how I respond to that.
Where's your bill in the legislative process?
It's currently in the Judiciary Committee.
What kind of response have you heard so far from your colleagues?
We've had quite a decent number of members sign on to as in a co-sponsorship. I think that's an indication of concern. I think we all recognize the threat that political violence, has brought home. I certainly think that the assassination in Minnesota, made it all the more real. I mean, simply because this was a former Speaker of the House in Minnesota. This was a state legislator, so we are colleagues, from another state away, and I think that made it very real for us that this threat has come home in a lot of ways, that like it has filtered down to even lower state offices. This isn't just about targeting the federal government. Just a few short weeks ago, there was a Virginia council person who was set on fire outside of his office. So this is filtering down to the lowest of local offices. And so I think a lot of my colleagues recognize the danger. I think that's why they've signed on. I think that's why there's an appetite to do everything and anything to keep us safe, and hold individuals accountable who commit these acts.
Do you think political violence has a broader impact on how citizens trust and view their democracy?
Absolutely. I think the difference between us and an authoritarian society or even a third world country is that in strong, well-functioning democracies, there has to be a belief that if you don't like the election outcome, there's future elections, that you can organize, you can advocate, you can knock doors, you can participate in the political process, you can change public opinion. And I think if people see us devolve into mindless violence and these sort of parochial, pernicious desire to just strike out at anyone we don't like, I think people lose faith in the political process. I think they pull away. I think they stop participating, and they become cynical, because I think people realize that they can see society unraveling in that instance, and they recognize what that means for us. In authoritarian countries, if you don't like a political opponent, you car bomb them, or you assassinate them. That sort of stuff we expect in Russia is, you kill your political opponent, or they disappear under mysterious circumstances. And in the United States, and I think in functioning industrial democracies, no, like you don't like somebody, you write their office, you advocate, you mobilize against them, you try to tell your fellow neighbors that this person is wrong in a political sense, or wrong in a policy sense. But I think when people see violence happening, and they believe that they could maybe be an unintentional victim, who wants to go to a rally or go to a polling station if, God forbid, somebody decides I'm going to blow the polling station up, or I don't want to go see my political candidate that I believe in, because what if that's the day somebody comes to that event to harm that elected official and I'm caught in the crossfire? So the whole system can't function if people have a reasonable belief that any particular instance of political expression, free expression, could be targeted by someone.
We've been speaking with Representative Josh Siegel. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.